Hi everyone, welcome back! In this video, I'm about to do something quite crazy. Remember the video about my go-to supplies for 2024? Well, having so many different watercolor palettes to choose from was still leaving me quite overwhelmed. Don't get me wrong, I love having options, but the reason I had so many in my art kit was because I'm trying to narrow down my watercolors and find my absolute favorites. I'd love to try new watercolors, but I've been trying to be more mindful and keep supplies I love the most on hand, while also trying to use up the supplies that I've been finding more challenging to use. Either because they don't spark as much joy, as Marie Kondo would say, or because the color selections aren't giving me as much inspiration. I also have the same color across different brands, and I'm trying to keep only one watercolor of each color. So, while I don't feel I had too many watercolors in my art kit, I wanted to reduce my options even further. So I took a page from the Sophia Nygaard book and decided to do a Frankenpalette. If you don't know who Sophia is, she is a YouTuber who has several videos on combining all the different shades or scents into one ultimate shade or scent of a particular type of thing or product. For example, she has done Franken candles, Franken lipsticks, you get the idea. When I took a look at my leftovers palette, and after I had to resort to picking yellows and blues from other palettes so I could use my other shades of leftover paint, I decided that combining similar colors from what was available in my art kit was a good choice. So at first I was going to use the current leftovers palette as the ultimate Frankenpalette, since I love the massive wells it has. But then I saw someone online use the palette I just showed in the beginning of this video. It has its own foldable silicone water cup, and the palette sits inside it. The palette itself also has a silicone inner lid, which makes it airtight or leak-proof. It has 16 wells, which are still considerably big when compared to a half pan, and that's exactly what I need since I'm combining different watercolors together. So, to do this Frankenpalette, I started by looking at all the colors in my kit and tried to come up with 16 different color families or groups so that I would have one per well in my new palette. I also decided on the color placements for the new palette. After taking a look at what I had available, these are the color families I decided to go with: white, 2 yellows, orange, 2 reds, purple, 2 blues, teal, 2 greens, 2 browns, grey, and black. The palettes and brands I ended up combining into this Frankenpalette included CassArt, Sakura Koi, Ecoline, which had already been dried from liquid into half pans, Winsor & Newton Professional, and of course the leftovers palette itself. I decided to keep the Shimmer DIY watercolors out of this palette. To help me transfer the colors, I used a clay shaping tool and an old brush. I also used scrap pieces of paper to swatch the colors and recorded in my sketchbook which colors went into which mix and their end result. It is worth to note that with the creation of this Frankenpalette, I have now been able to condense my art kit to that one big bag. In the end, I did have a little bit too much of a few of the colors, like orange, red, green, brown and black, so I kept the extra paint in the leftovers palette so I can top up these colors at a later date. A quick tip for you: if you ever want to have plastic pans stick to a plastic palette but don't want to use blue tack, is to use some leftover watercolor on the thicker side and paint it on the plastic palette and under the plastic pan you want to stick. It might take a little bit to dry, but after it dries, it should be pretty secure. I've been using this technique for years and so far it hasn't failed me. I didn't record the mixing and paint transferring process, but here is what I did. I began by swatching all the similar colors together. I then did a test mix where I used the colors I planned on merging to make sure I was not accidentally creating muddy colors. For colors where I planned to have 2 separate wells, like the yellows, reds, blues, greens and browns, I tested both mixes at the same time, just in case I needed to move one of the original colors from one mix to the other, but in most cases this was not necessary. I then swatched all the original colors I planned on using into that mix into the sketchbook. When the planning was done and all the watercolors had been assigned a color family or color mix, I then started with the actual mixing process. To be able to mix the dried watercolors, I had to soften them first. The easiest way was to add water into the dried watercolors and leave them to soak overnight. I found that most of them were fully soft by morning time. However, the hardest ones to soften were the Sakura Koi Watercolours. Not only are these watercolors more dense, but the wells are smaller for the amount of paint in them, and the palette itself was not airtight. So sometimes I needed to repeat this process until I had managed to soften all the paint in that pan. Also, I didn't soften all the watercolors at the same time, as I didn't want to risk accidentally mixing them all together. Instead, I worked on one color mix at a time and skipped one in between in the palette order. So, for example, I first worked on the white, then skipped the color yellow and worked on the warmer yellow, then skipped the orange and worked on the warmer red, and so on. This way, I worked on the wells that weren't touching to avoid having very wet colors accidentally running into the neighboring wells. Now, as I mentioned, in order to mix and transfer the different colors into the final well for that color family, I added water to the initial colors and let them sit overnight to soften. In the morning, I checked how soft they were. If they needed more time, I scooped what I could into the new palette well, added more water to the initial watercolor, and left again to soften until the evening, and so on until all the colors of that color family were all in the same well. As a final step, I made sure to mix properly when all the colors of that mix had been transferred into the new palette well. I repeated these steps until all the colors had been transferred and mixed, and then left the palette to dry for about a month. This process was started during the winter, so it did take me longer to have the watercolors dry in the palette. Now, back to the Frankenpalette. Some of the colors I ended up not having to mix at all, but majority are a mix. Here is what went into each of the final colors in order of appearance in the palette. The white is a mix of the Sakura Koi 003 Chinese White and the Winsor Newton Professional Titanium White. In the cool yellow, I mixed the CassArt Yellow Lemon, Sakura Koi 052 Lemon Yellow, and the Ecoline Liquid Watercolor in 205 Lemon Yellow. For the warm yellow, I used the Sakura Koi 076 Permanent Yellow Deep and the Ecoline Liquid Watercolor in 202 Deep Yellow. The orange is a premix from a couple of years ago, which I have rarely touched. At the time, I was struggling to mix an orange for a monarch butterfly, so I ended up with way too much leftover orange. The warm red is just the Sakura Koi 014 Vermilion Hue. In the cool red mix, I used 4 different colors. These were some leftover paint from the leftover palette, CassArt Alizarin Crimson, Sakura Koi 022 Crimson Lake, and Ecoline Liquid Watercolor in 332 Magenta. I really wanted to use up the CassArt Alizarin Crimson. Unlike the one that comes in the CassArt Professional Travel set, which is very vibrant and beautiful, their tube version is incredibly dull and I don't really like it. The purple is just leftover watercolor purple. The warm blue includes in its mix a classic warm blue, which is ultramarine blue, this one from CassArt, and also I included in here the Sakura Koi 142 Prussian blue. I actually like this ultramarine blue a lot, but unfortunately the CassArt tube formulas don't dry on the pans where I live, which makes them not very convenient for me. In the cool blue, I mixed the Sakura Koi 143 Cobalt Blue Hue and the Ecoline 578 Sky Blue Cyan. The teal is just like the purple, a leftover watercolor. Next are the greens and browns. For both of these, I mixed both a lighter and a darker shade. In the lighter green, I included the Sakura Koi 114 Permanent Green Pale and the Ecoline Liquid Watercolor in 600 Green, while for the darker green, I used the green I had on my leftovers palette, together with the Sakura Koi 072 Viridian Hue. The lighter brown is just the Sakura Koi 071 Yellow Ochre on its own, and the darker brown mix includes both the brown from my leftovers palette and the Sakura Koi 197 Light Red. I remember that in my leftover brown color, I had once mixed some Pelikan drawing ink in sepia which definitely overpowered the light red. The final two wells are the Winsor & Newton Professional Watercolor in Neutral Tint for the grey, which is a color that for some reason I keep forgetting I already have in a pan somewhere, so I keep drying in more pans, and lastly, the black. The black is also a mix of 4 different watercolors. The Leftovers Black, which is in itself a mix of whatever I had at the time in the Leftovers palette, the Sakura Koi 004 Ivory Black, the Winsor & Newton Professional Watercolor in Lamp Black, and the Ecoline Liquid Watercolor in 700 Black. The mixing process itself took me about 2 weeks to complete. Also, I didn't mention any pigments in the list above because honestly, I didn't see the point. Any color that came from the Leftovers palette is a mix with years worth of colors poured into, including both pigment and dye-based watercolors. Also, the Sakura Koi watercolors don't have pigment information, and the Ecoline watercolors are dye-based and not pigment-based. Now, to finish off, once the palette had dried enough, I decided to swatch the colors and do a quick color mixing study. From my swatches, I can see that the downside of this palette is definitely the purple. As both the red and blues are not themselves very clean mixes, the resulting purples are very dull. Besides that, I love the mixing results I'm getting with this palette. I've also been trying to get back into a project I wanted to do for years, which was to sketch my supplies. This way, in the years to come, I can remember the supplies I used to have when I flip through my old sketchbooks. By the way, would you like to see my older sketchbooks? Let me know down below in the comments if you'd like to see them. Now, although this project took a long time to complete, I'm glad I did it. Not only have I downsized the watercolors I've been trying to use up, but I've also created a brand new palette I'll never have again, which is honestly quite nice. I'm going to try my best to finish using every color in here before I attempt to do this again. But I have a feeling, with my passion for trying new watercolors, that by the time that happens, I'll have a brand new assortment of colors to mix into a new Frankenpalette. It will also be fun to challenge myself to paint with whatever colors I have left. I've done that challenge before with the Winsor & Newton Sketchers Pocket Box palette, and I was surprised by the results I got with the limited color choices. Lastly, I would like to remind you that my channel is being rebranded. I'll no longer be known as Ini Designs, and I'll now be known as INS Illustrations, which is Inish but without the E. Back when I started watercolors, I used to use my personal Instagram account to share my art. I eventually decided to create a separate account just for my art and needed a name for my new art account. At the time, the only thing I could think of was Ini Designs. Ini is my nickname at home, and Designs just felt appropriate. Ini Designs has been fine until now, but I was always aware that it was hard to search for me because of it having so many I's in the name. So I wanted to change my art account name to something still very personal but easier to remember, and I finally have a name that I feel it's appropriate. Inish without the E, which is spelled INS. This has been my gaming name since many years. The reason I use Inish without the E is because the E on my name actually has an accentuation that doesn't exist in English, and I could never write my name correctly in the games when naming my character. And basically that's the story of the new name. So from the next video onwards, expect to see the new name and a new look to the channel. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. It was indeed something very unusual to do, but I'm glad I did it. If you also liked it, please click the like button. You can also subscribe and click the notification button to see what happens in the next video. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video.